Paper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Well, hello there, and welcome to Nowhere to Hide. We're going to be talking about a subject that, if it's not on your mind, it will be within another month or two as the kids are headed back to school. We're going to talk about school choice today, and in particular, how school choice has become such a difficult subject. It's fraught with danger, and apparently it poses a pretty big threat to people who have somewhat of a controlling nature. Now, I don't know if you have thought this through, if you've considered, well, you know what, the school my kid is going to is just fine. Maybe you feel like I don't even have, any kind of a dog in this fight. But I assure you that there is a lot of wrangling that's going on, and it's about the choice, school choice in particular, that we have to keep coming back to. That's the foundational issue, and that is, whose choice is it? And furthermore, are we funding students or are we simply funding systems? So to illustrate what I'm talking about, I want to share with you an editorial here. This is from former Idaho Attorney General Jim Jones, published in the Idaho Capital Sun. The headline says, "The U.S. Supreme Court warns against state funding of private schools." Now, in particular, there's a recent Supreme Court ruling. Actually, there's been a number of Supreme Court rulings that have limited government power and expanded personal freedom. And this has been very distressing, again, to people with a controlling nature. Jim Jones is saying we need to improve our public education system by ensuring it has sufficient funding to properly educate our kids, not to consign it, rather, to the trash heap. Now, there's a couple things I'm going to do through this, and I hope you won't think I'm just being, petty, but when he talks about public education, we could also very well say government education, because after all, these are government-run schools. They are funded with money taken from the taxpayers by the government. So it's not meant to be a pejorative. It's just, if we say public education, that is a warmer, fluffier word. It has far less negative connotations, but to put it in its proper perspective, it is government education. And you'll see why as we talk about school choice, that government education is not the same thing as education within a free market. By the way, when he talks about properly educating our kids, I have to ask the question, according to whom? According to the government or according to what parents actually want? That's an important question that has to be answered, because it comes back to whose choice is it anyway? And is our only alternative besides properly funding and upholding the government education system to let it be consigned to the trash heap? Is that really the only choice we have? Because I think we may have a few more alternatives than we're being told. Jim Jones says it's a given that there will be a concerted effort in the Idaho legislature next year to enact legislation such as a school voucher program that would allow state funds to be used for private schooling. Now, I'm going to stop here for just a moment and just point out, state funds is another euphemistic way of saying taxpayer money, because the state does not generate wealth on its own. It does not create wealth. The only thing it can do is take wealth from people who have actually, through their productive labor, created that wealth and generated that money. This is an important distinction in that it's not like, gee, we're taking money from the state after it worked so hard. No, the state has taken that money from you and I after we have worked so hard, so let's not forget whose money it really is. He says, if such legislation were approved, SCOTUS, meaning the Supreme Court of the United States, has just made it clear that Idaho taxpayer money will have to also go to support religious schooling. And the fact is that the state will have little oversight on the use of those funds or what theology the taxpayers will be required to finance. I'm sorry, Jim, you're better than this. This is just pure scaremongering. First of all, there's the idea that this taxpayer money will have to go to support religious schooling. What's more accurate, a better way to say this, is some of those taxpayer funds may actually be used at the parent's choice to send their child to a school that includes religious instruction. But it's not some legislator's choice. It's not some bureaucrat's choice. It's the parent's choice. There's a big difference. And when he says there will be little oversight on the use of those funds, so what? Whose kids are they? Are they the state's or are they the parents' kids? So what exactly would constitute, a requisite amount of oversight? Can it only be people who make decisions that agree with whatever the prevailing attitude of the state is at that moment? because that doesn't sound like a very consistent attitude to go along with a free society. That sounds like a very conformist and uniform ideology that would be more at home in an authoritarian setting. And finally, what theology will the taxpayers be required to finance? I don't know why, but there's almost an irrational fear of religion. Or is that what it's going to be? Taxpayers are going to be financing theology? No, it just simply means that some taxpayers will choose to use that money, which they paid into the system, to send their kids to get more of a theological instruction along with their education. That's all it is. It's not church and state being torn down, the separation being torn down. Now, he reminds us the Idaho Constitution strictly prohibits the use of public funds for any form of religious education. And there's actually wisdom in this. I mean, the founders didn't give us a theology, or a theocratic system for that matter. They gave us some very strict separation because they didn't want an official religion. He says for the past 132 years, the separation of public money from religious instruction has been rigorously or rigidly upheld in Idaho. Now, the Supreme Court has unfortunately provided a workaround, says Jim Jones. Those who want to pay taxpayer money to religious schools can simply pass a voucher program to evade the prohibition in our Constitution. Notice that fealty to the Constitution. Isn't that nice? Suddenly it matters when it says that we shouldn't be doing certain things. But I think he's wrong about this in the sense that it hasn't prevented religious instruction. Sorry, that was an interesting Freudian slip. Because the secular humanist atheist model that is right now the predominant worldview that's taught within our schools is very much a religious ideology, every bit as much so as anything you would find under on the spectrum of Judeo-Christian thought. They have doctrines, they have dogma, they proselytize, and most importantly, that secular humanist atheist religion is extremely jealous of any other faith that competes for, competes for allegiance. Something to consider. They'll never call it a religion. After all, it's supposed to be neutral ground. Look at what's being taught in our schools, though, from the gender fluidity to the various, pronoun games to whatever it may be, critical race theory. There's a very strong religious sense to how it's being taught and how any opposition to it is seen as just outrageous and somehow an attack. Jim Jones says, Idaho voters need to let legislators know that the diversion of taxpayer money to private schooling will further degrade public education for Idaho kids. Okay, wait a minute. Public education has somehow been degraded? I mean, even without voucher programs? I'd like to know a little bit more about what that degradation is. And listen to this. Legislators are mandated by the Idaho Constitution to establish and maintain a general, uniform, and thorough system of public, free, common schools. Now, again, this is government schools that we're talking about here. But he says the legislature has chronically failed to honor that mandate. Now, I don't know what the fulfillment of that mandate would look like. As you'll see, he gets into funding here. And it appears that the funding is really a sticking point. The Idaho Supreme Court ruled in 2005 that Idaho's funding of educational facilities was wholly inadequate to meet the constitutional requirement. The situation is growing worse each year. A study disclosed that it would take about $850 billion to bring public school facilities up to good condition. And I have to ask, is that just in the state of Idaho? Nearly $1 trillion, really? Or are we talking, is there a broader spectrum here? Because that's an awful lot of money. Supplemental school levies against taxpayers have increased from $140 million in the 2011-2012 school year to $218 million in 2021-2022. And Idaho has ranked last in the nation for per pupil spending during each of the last two school years. And he says the state is obviously vulnerable to legal action for its constitutional failure to support its school system. Now, a couple things here that need to be pointed out. Number one, some of the most well-funded school districts in terms of per pupil spending in the nation include places like New York State, including places like New Jersey, where the average per pupil spending is miles ahead of states like Idaho. And yet their academic performance is also miles lower. So I guess what I'm getting at here is simply pounding more money into, a hole does not equate with, boy, our students are finally getting something very worthwhile, and this is resulting in better education. It doesn't. So when he talks about the state is vulnerable to legal action, I wonder who's going to bring that legal action. Is it going to be teachers' unions? Is it going to be administrators? Is it going to be people who will directly benefit from that increased funding, particularly the overhead required to administer these sometimes top-heavy systems? Because if that's the case, maybe a little competition is needed to ensure that they are performing at their optimum levels. Jim says if legislators take money that should be used for public schools, according to whom, and divert it to private schooling, they will surely invite a lawsuit. The state has no business supporting private schools, while the public school system is suffering from insufficient funding. And, I get it. Look, my wife is a public school teacher, and I'm sure she would say, yes, we would prefer to have, greater funding. But this presupposes that there's only one way to do this. And all I'm suggesting here is that perhaps there are other ways. And that doesn't mean that you have to tear down and, get rid of the public school system entirely. But the idea of competition for some reason is very disturbing. And this is why, Jim is having such a hard time with it. Now, he takes special aim at the Idaho Freedom Foundation, the so-called Idaho Freedom Foundation. So-called, really? I mean, do they push for freedom? Do they stand up for greater freedom, more responsive government? So-called. And its supporters in the legislature are doing their level best to sabotage the public school system. How are they doing that, you might ask? Well, perhaps it's simply by recognizing that perhaps some choice would be a good thing in this matter. They worked hard to underfund the school system, endangering its effectiveness, or perhaps just simply holding people accountable for the expenditures that are being made and questioning if this isn't working, if we're not getting the kind of outcomes that we should be getting, maybe that money would be better spent somewhere else. These are legitimate questions that should be asked by people who take their freedom seriously and take their citizenship seriously. Then they point to the lack of student achievement as grounds for supporting school choice alternatives. A voucher program, he says, would be a disaster for public schools, particularly in rural areas where the local school is the heart and soul of the community. Now, granted, there's a lot of people who really do find that to be a great place to gather, particularly around sporting events. But I think this is giving a moral standing and a moral authority to government-run schools that I'm not sure is entirely deserved. Not that there aren't, great examples of community and people coming together, but are we to believe that that wouldn't happen in the absence of a government-run school? Jim Jones says local taxpayers would remain on the hook for all the bonds they had to float because of the legislature's failure to meet its constitutional funding responsibility. So obviously he's taken a very hard stand here against the idea of school choice. So let's debunk this with a little bit of help from some of our friends here at I got to make sure I get the name right here. This is in conjunction with the Idaho Freedom Foundation, the Center for American Education, specifically Caitlin Shepard and Anna K. Miller. They have put together a wonderful paper. You can get this by going to idahofreedom.org. And check out Myth Educated, Debunking Common Education Choice Misconceptions in Idaho. So first of all, let's talk about how education choice supposedly doesn't benefit rural students. The fact is, education choice helps rural students who aren't adequately served by their local public school. How? Well, by expanding the number of educational opportunities available to them and enabling them to supplement the limited opportunities available at public schools. Now, that shouldn't translate into an idea, well, public school is terrible and we should all just turn our backs. It's simply looking for where can we get these needs met that aren't currently being met? That's a fair question to ask. Myth number 2, education choice programs defund public schools. Fact, giving families money to spend on their children's education through a choice program does not defund public schools or irreparably harm the remaining students. In fact, forcing families to subsidize public schools their children do not attend takes money from families. It's a double whammy. And if you can't imagine, well, why would some people choose not to avail themselves of a public school? I don't know a better way to explain it other than simply education is not and has never been a one-size-fits-all proposition. Some students will learn better in a much more structured type of environment, like you would find in a government school. Other students are more kinesthetic learners. Some people learn better, through internships and the like. Let's not pretend that everybody has to go the same way and that it's only going to work if we do it this one way. That favors people who prefer to have people that think pretty much the same about most common items that are going on in their lives. But it doesn't really mean that much in terms of raising thinking, productive, active citizens who are willing to look at problems and not wait for somebody in authority to tell them what needs to be done, but to actually start seeking out the answers for themselves. You might understand why that would be a threat to again, people with a controlling nature. Myth number 3, public schools are held accountable while private schools are not. Really? Fact, private schools are accountable to parents and the public, while public schools lack democratic, financial, and academic accountability. Now, yes, there is some accountability built into the bureaucracy that goes into running government schools. But when it comes to private schools, you have something even more efficient. You have the market. Meaning, if those schools are overpromising and underdelivering for parents, they have every right to vote with their feet and vote with their wallets and take their kids somewhere else. Now, if you try that with a public school, you might get some response, or then again, you might just get the runaround in a system. I think about the parents in Virginia who complained about certain policies that were putting transgender students into their daughters' restrooms, and these parents were held up, and I mean like followed as domestic terrorists and some kind of extremists simply for speaking out. So are we talking about that kind of accountability, or are we talking about the kind of accountability that says, if you're not performing in a way that actually is helping to educate my child, I have every right to take my business elsewhere? That's harder to do with a system that is compulsory and that also, is administered by money that is taken from the taxpayers. Myth number 4. There is inadequate oversight in education choice programs, causing them to be highly susceptible to abuse and fraud. Fact, education choice programs can be designed with transparency and accountability measures in place so that parents are accountable for their expenditures. There's also the idea that who really has that child's best interests in mind? Now, I know there are some very dedicated teachers, and I would even say some administrators out there who care deeply about educating kids and trying to impart what they can to create good, solid, productive citizens. But I don't think that even comes close to the kind of accountability and love that a parent has, as well as the knowledge of what is best for each individual kid. Parents know their children best. Parents are more likely to make good choices for their kids. I guess the only other way I could put it is, I don't think it's possible to pay somebody enough to love your child as much as you do. Myth number 5, education choice programs are unconstitutional. This was, I think, the main premise of what Jim Jones was talking about. Fact of the matter is, though, courts have repeatedly upheld private education choice programs in the face of both federal and state constitutional challenges. And it's not a matter of, you can only have one. Nobody should be able to choose, something that takes kids out of public schools. For some kids, it's just not a proper fit. And again, if you want to really see those myths taken apart in detail, I would encourage you, check out the paper that I was just citing from, Myth Educated. Again, this is fantastic work from the Center for American Education. They really have done a remarkable job, and I think this is a great place to start for at least looking at alternatives. I'm not suggesting you have to believe it. I'm just saying this is a point of view you probably won't get through most mainstream media sources, which for some reason always seem to come down on the side of, no, government is the way to do it, and there's nothing else that should be considered. So let's talk about a couple of court cases that have kind of added some fuel to the fire in terms of school choice. In a major win for parents, the Supreme Court ruled in Carson v. Macon recently that Maine's tuition assistance program could not discriminate against parents who select private religious schools for their children. Now, Maine's program allowed families living in districts that lack a secondary school, which equates to more than half of the state's school administrative units, to designate a secondary school for their children, which may be public or private. Now, it's not just, you can find another school somewhere within the state. Listen to this. The district then provides payment to the school to assist with the student's tuition cost. Parents can select any school within or outside of Maine without geographical boundaries. The student's tuition funding could even be sent to schools in foreign countries. Now, if that strikes you, that's unpatriotic, but I'm going to say maybe some parents find that that's the better choice. That's where their kids are going to get the type of education that they, the parents, the primary people with responsibility for that child, would want them to get their education. You don't have to agree with it, but unless you think it's fair game for somebody to interfere with your choices for your children, this is a good place to step back and let them make that choice. Now, again, Carrie Ingram in the Washington Times also notes the Supreme Court's 6-3 decision penned by Chief Justice Roberts stated the state pays tuition for certain students at private schools so long as the schools are not religious. Now, this is discrimination against religion, says Justice Roberts. Citing previous court rulings, the majority noted that the First Amendment protects against indirect coercion and penalties on the free exercise of religion, not just outright prohibitions. And Justice Roberts further wrote that a state's anti-establishment interest does not justify enactments that exclude some members of the community from an otherwise generally available public benefit because of their religious exercise if the money flows through the independent choices of private benefit recipients. That's the key. The parents are the ones who make that choice. So as long as it's the parents who make the choice where that money goes, even if it is money that comes to them through a taxpayer-funded program like vouchers, that's their choice to make. As Carrie Ingram explains, the Supreme Court decision is a win for parents in Maine and across the country, as the ruling sets the stage for other states to grant more families educational freedom. Parents must be afforded the opportunity, free from discrimination, to select an education avenue for their child in alignment, not at odds with their values and faith. Wow. Now, there's another one. This one goes back a few years. I believe this was in 2002. And this is the Zellman v. Simmons-Harris case. Here's what was at stake in this case: the right of parents to direct the education and upbringing of their children, the state's ability to offer school choice programs free from fear of attack by those who oppose parents' rights in school choice, and whether parents of children in failing schools have the right to use state-funded vouchers to send their child to an alternative private school of their choice, including a religious school. So here's a summary of how that case shook out. The Cleveland, Ohio public school system was plagued with poorly performing schools, predominantly in the inner cities. So in order to provide parents with the opportunity to send their child to a better school, the city developed a voucher system whereby parents were permitted to use the vouchers to enroll their child at another public school or in a private school of the parents' choosing. The majority of the private schools that participated in the program were faith-based schools. And the system was challenged as a violation of the Establishment Clause because religious schools were accepting government funds. Now, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the voucher system did not constitute government endorsement of religion because the parents were the ones who determined where those funds were to be spent. Therefore, if the government funds were provided to sectarian schools, it was due to the independent, private choice of parents, and it was not at the government's discretion. Now, again, I understand this is going to cause concern, maybe even consternation for some people. And I don't know if it's from a fear that, somebody's going to teach these kids religion or go around imposing goodness on them. And granted, I don't want people imposing goodness on my kids either. But I think the real thing we have to keep in mind here is choice. Whose choice is it, and who does this choice benefit? Are we really just trying to fund systems, or are we trying to fund the education of these individual children? Now, there are plenty of alternatives that can come about. Let's talk a little bit about some of those. These are some of the takeaways that I'd like you to at least consider from what we've covered here. First of all, it's not the proper role of government to tell families how to use their tax dollars. That's the individual's private choice. And the simplest way to put this is, if you wish for your private choices to be respected, you better respect the private choices of other people, even if you don't agree with them. Secondly, as taxpayers, it's their money, not the state's money. So let's not pretend that this came to us from some magical, bureaucracy that created this money and we have to do exactly as it said, or it's just, we're not worthy of using that money. The money was taken from the taxpayers, and the taxpayers deserve a chance to use that money as best they can. Now, I understand there are people who don't even pay taxes who would still benefit from this, but I don't see that necessarily as a downside. I mean, after all, we worry about, well, what about the poorest children? Aren't they going to be left behind? Not if there's real competition. Wouldn't it make sense that we would have better, more streamlined ways to come forward to educate children than simply this one size fits all, the put them in a, basically an assembly line and we run them through the factory and out at the other end come these totally assembled widgets? And finally, the question that we really need to take away from this is, are we educating children or are we simply maintaining a state monopoly? Because when I look at the editorial that Jim Jones published here, questioning, oh my goodness, this is such a dangerous thing, to have school choice when our public school system, our government school system is failing. Why is it so important that we maintain that monopoly, particularly if it's not performing at the level that it could or that it should? I mean, come on. In the world of business, if a business fails to perform, it dies or it is replaced or other more competitive, better businesses come along and make it obsolete. That's not a bad thing. That's how we get most of the things that actually make our lives worthwhile and beneficial. So wherever you stand on the idea of education, keep in mind, choice is always a better thing. And even if someone makes choices that you may not necessarily agree with, that's still a good thing. Peaceful choices. If they can make it for their kids, you should be able to make it for your kids. But let's remember, it's the choice of parents first and foremost, and anything that helps to promote school choice is definitely something that is worthy of consideration. There are different avenues we can go from, savings accounts, educational savings accounts to tuition tax credits and so forth. Personally, I favor any move that actually just allows that money to stay in the parent's pocket and then is forgiven on their state taxes. I think that's a very fair way to go about it. But the bottom line is, just because it's a government-run system doesn't mean that you are bound to forever have your loyalty to this. I think that it's a misinterpretation of the Idaho Constitution to say that, that the only proper thing to do is to fund this system as fully as possible, even if it means going deeply into debt. We already see a tendency to do that on the part of most governments at most levels. So let's use our heads. Let's bring a little competition. And again, never forget, this is really about what is the best possible education for these kids. And if you have kids that are in that system or that you need to be making those kind of decisions for, then my friend, you have a dog in this fight. So it might be a good idea to get more active and get better involved. Again, I recommend idahofreedom.org. If you'd like to see some great resources on this, the work that is being done there is tremendous. And it'll help you get your mind around these issues and not simply be at the mercy of, what politicians or some of their mainstream enablers are wanting to tell you. That's it for today's show. I'm Brian Hyde. This is Nowhere to Hide.
Reporters are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing